Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. I cannot believe how quickly our class is going, but I have definitely enjoyed interacting with you all online, as well as visiting with several of you in my office. So, thank you for coming by. This week, we are going to continue our study of the characteristics of gifted learners. Before I go into our assignment for this week, let's talk about this case study with Adam. So, again, true story. I did not teach Adam. Of course, we have changed his name, but one of my colleagues taught this student. And what's interesting is the obvious task commitment that we're seeing for using Renzulli's terminology. Um, Adam is just obsessed with finishing this turkey and doing the best job as possible. That is one of the very common indicators of giftedness. Students who are typically gifted get very obsessed with their work. But I want to hazard you to determining that to mean that they are obsessed with all of their work. It kind of comes and goes. There are certain assignments that they just really want to focus on, and they have a vision and they want to do it well, and they will not be happy with themselves until that assignment is done perfectly. So, hence the other common characteristic, meaning perfectionism. So Adam is definitely demonstrating that, mainly because he wants to get this done in his time and do a good job with it. But I don't want you to extrapolate that to mean that, oh, all of our gifted students are constantly trying to do everything perfectly. Oftentimes it's the opposite. They do the basic or even no work on what we want them to be working on, but then they're perfectionists about either another class or oftentimes a whole other passion that they have outside of school. So, yes, task commitment is indicative of gifted children, but let's also remember they are not always committed to your task. So, you have to keep that in mind. Another really common characteristic that we're seeing is questioning of the way things are done. So you see Adam say, well, why does it have to be done this way? He's actually a little rude to the teacher. And this is quite common as well. So gifted students, they don't do the best job accepting procedures unless they see purpose in them. So, for example, Adam doesn't understand the procedure of finishing work at a certain time when he thinks that there's more time that needs to be given to that assignment. A lot of times, gifted children will question authority, and as teachers and educators, we immediately kind of tense up, like, that's very rude, you shouldn't be treating me like that. But it's not a personal thing, it's they are definitely asynchronously developing, so they're kind of thinking at a higher level. And I've even had some gifted students propose new methods of doing things that do make more sense. So actually, sometimes the way that they contradict the procedural expectations in the classroom are actually indicative of that advanced problem solving, which is yet another characteristic of the gifted students. So a couple things before I go through some of your specific responses. Remember that Adam is only 6 years old. And in South Carolina, we do not officially recognize students for gifted and talented services until third grade. So even if Adam is indeed gifted, which we cannot tell off of this one observation, even if he is gifted, unless in a more rare environment like an autonomous learner model or a different type of school, he won't receive gifted services officially until he's in third grade. So I notice a lot of you in the way that you were writing your discussion posts mentioned he needs gifted services, he needs gifted services, almost in the sense of like, he's gifted, let's put him in gifted services. But really, what's more important in this case is we have students like Adam in all of our classes, and gifted education is more about the regular education teacher than necessarily the gifted coordinator. So his teachers need to be aware of some of his characteristics and the fact that he may be gifted. Again, may, we need some more data there. And it's not a matter of he's gifted, go to the gifted education classroom. In fact, several schools have very, very little gifted education support, and we'll look more into that in our next learning module on whether or not gifted education is a right or a privilege. So, to highlight a couple of things, I appreciated how Chrissy started her discussion on a very positive note in the sense of let's highlight the good things that are happening. Advent's parents are here, the gifted coordinator is here, and the teacher is here. I'm going to be honest, guys, that doesn't happen very often. So the fact that we have buy-in on every side is a really good place to start. So I was happy to see her highlight that. Again, when we're talking about gifted services, it's not like there's a gifted office right next door to the regular education classroom. So I did notice a lot of you guys say he needs gifted services. He needs gifted services. What he really needs in this case, because he's only 6, is his teachers to recognize these behaviors and his teachers to create an appropriate learning environment and appropriate challenge. I do believe Mary, but I believe you go by Missa. If you correct me if I'm wrong, she mentioned that it's important that we create this learning environment for the students, which I definitely agree with. So it's important that we are seeing these indicators of giftedness, but we can't assume based off this one drawing that he is gifted. I believe this is great evidence toward that, but we cannot make that conclusion based off of just one piece of evidence. So in education, when we talk about making sure that we are telling the whole story and that we have enough data to support our conclusion, we use a term called triangulation, which, think of a triangle, right? Triangle has 3 points. So the concept is 1 point alone of data doesn't really tell us much, but if 1, 2, 3 points are all saying the same thing, then those ideas are matching up and the conclusion is stronger. Several of you did mention that, oh, these are potential indicators of giftedness. Let's get him tested. Again, we don't test for that with traditional tests in terms of achievement until the 2nd grade. It is definitely possible that some younger students have been tested for aptitude using some form of intelligence test, but these indicators are evidence, guys. It does not have to be an official test to be evidence for gifted characteristics. So the fact that his teacher is seeing all of these characteristics, putting them into a checklist like the one that you're completing for this week, that is a piece of data. So I don't want you to conclude, hey, he may be gifted because of these indicators. Now let's get him tested. When we look at traditional tests like aptitude tests, achievement tests, there's a lot of issues there, and we don't want to make one decision based on those either. So I do think it's important that you realize that these indicators that you're seeing in the classroom are data. And that's why it's so important that our regular education teachers have this type of training so they can keep an eye out on that student and create the appropriate learning environment. One thing that I saw several of you mention was, okay, well, we just need to serve Adam better, and maybe he could have more time, and maybe we need to write different lesson plans for him, which I agree. But when we are teaching, we have, guys, like 25 students, and it is hard to keep track of those 25 students, let alone write different lesson plans and list different activities for them every single day. So when you get to 595, if you have not taken that course, we do talk about differentiation, which is basically providing different content, different ways of approaching learning, and different methods to show our learning. So yes, differentiation is so important in the classroom. And I'll preach that over and over again in these classes. But suggesting we'll just do something completely different is so great, but it's probably not going to happen. So something we have to be careful of in terms of gifted ed is really challenging ourselves to make practical suggestions. So a couple of things that I wanted to mention with that, if we really want to serve Adam, he's only 6, right? So do we want to put him into a special school all for gifted children? That would be great, but also he's only 6, so we need, first off, evidence that he is indeed gifted. Um, and also, we need to be providing different types of learning for him, environments for him to fully develop. So rather than going to what I think is a little extreme and proposing he's super gifted, let's put him in a gifted school, let's talk about some practical things that his teacher could do tomorrow. Number one, change the environment. So it does sound like he's on a pretty strict schedule, which is common and also pretty unavoidable, not only in school, but also in the work environment. Um, I have a boss here at Winthrop, and even if my work is not as perfect as I want it to be, which it never is, I still have to produce work and meet deadlines. That is just a fact of life. So simply saying, oh, there's no deadlines is a great idea, but is it practical? Does that really happen? So rather than saying, let's just make it super flexible, he can have as much time as he wants, let's bring that into more of a practical idea. My first thought for Adam would be discretion. So helping him understand which times are appropriate to really focus on this one activity, and when is it important to realize this doesn't have to be perfect. That's very important for gifted students. We have students who are definitely perfectionists. We also have students who are called multi-potential, which means they have multiple potentials. Put those two together, recipe for disaster. They cannot do everything, and they can't do everything perfectly. So discretion is a good thought. Making sure that she as a teacher is communicating expectations. Katrina had a great line saying that he's not living up to his definition of good. So it's important that the teacher is communicating the purpose of an assignment, but also providing a way for him to really focus on work. So instead of saying there's no deadlines for anything and you can do everything as deeply as you want to, that can get a little dangerous. But I have seen a couple of methods in the classroom where we provide for that in a more realistic way. One way, and several of you know my mom is a preschool teacher, she has, it's literally a pizza box covered in cute paper. She has a pizza box for every one of her students, and they write their name on it, and anything in that box they can keep and work on for as long as they want to. It's their opportunity to have one area of focus, and they keep adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. In times where there's free play or times where there's not as much going on in the classroom, they can ask for that box and keep adding to their ideas. That would be so great for Adam. Allowing him to choose something or even create something of his own that he really wants to focus on and let that continue is wonderful. But also he needs to learn the discretion of every time he writes his name, he doesn't have to do it perfectly. So just practical ways of balancing that are quite important. Another thing, I thought this was interesting. Hannah mentioned that he's probably a little bit wary of criticism, so I did like that point. Oftentimes, gifted students can be critical of themselves. You see that perfectionism. So hearing any kind of criticism from a person like in authority is a little bit difficult for them. So that makes sense, but also we do want to prepare our students to respond to criticism. So maybe making some form of like growth chart where they are tracking their progress and understanding that mistakes are fine. Overall, I think that you guys did a wonderful job on this discussion post. I agree. His actions are definitely providing evidence that he could be gifted. But let's steer away from saying he's gifted because of this one thing. We really want to triangulate and really want to get multiple sources of evidence. And also recognize that gifted services are not just outside They're not just a full new lesson plan. We need to be considering how we're serving gifted students within every single class session, but in a less drastic, completely separate manner. And that's where differentiation comes in. So now that we have talked through our case study, real briefly, I'll propose what we are doing for this module, or rather the second week of this module. So this week, you are completing a gifted child checklist and writing a narrative that concludes whether or not you think this child may be showing indicators of giftedness. Now, notice my terminology there. I'm not saying based on this one checklist, he or she is gifted. You're basically writing up a narrative about some of the indicators that could mean that he or she would do well with gifted education services. So if you look under module assignments, the assignment is in that folder along with a rubric. What I'm asking you to do is choose one student that you are close to, maybe someone you've taught in the field, maybe a little brother or sister, maybe someone from your church's Sunday school, maybe a neighbor, someone you babysit, any child you feel like you have a lot of information and contact with. So I want you to consider that child and complete the attached checklist based on that child's behaviors. Okay, I did give you the checklist as both a Word document and a PDF. I've had students request both, so I went ahead and uploaded both for you. So you're completing that checklist and then writing a narrative to discuss evidence of how you have seen indicators of giftedness. Now, what's important here is you make this really clear how you have actually seen it. So don't just tell me my neighbor is a good problem solver. How? When did you see that he was a really good problem solver? I remember babysitting one time and we lost the key when we were playing outside. And one of the children that I was babysitting, I can't remember everything, but he had this really genius way of searching for the key in the grass that he did plot by plot, and we did like, let's look in this square, let's look in that square, let's look in this square. That's a great indicator of problem solving ability, but I have to explain that to really make the narrative meaningful. Don't just say he's curious, say he's asking really deep questions about something specific. So all children like to ask questions, but let's think about, like, I'm really, really interested in sunflowers. And why are sunflowers yellow? Well, what is the pigment that makes them yellow? And what do they eat? And why are they so tall? And what's the benefit of being so tall? You see the difference between why is it bedtime? Why do I have to take these vitamins? Why can't I stay up later? Those are still questions, but they're not really indicative of the same thing. So be careful of how you're writing out your narrative. And lastly, I need you to quote at least 3 sources from your library materials. So again, you are completing the checklist, number 1, writing up a narrative with specific examples. Make sure that that checklist and those narratives are clearly supporting one another, and use at least 3 of your library resources to support your argument. So I'll be looking for that assignment by Sunday evening. Please be sure to review the rubric and ask me any questions that you may have. Thank you for being a wonderful class, and I will talk to you soon.